Paranoid is the second studio album by Black Sabbath. Released in 1970, it's regarded as perhaps the most influential record in the birth of heavy metal, setting a new precedent for a darker form of heavy rock that would resonate through the ages. Their self-titled debut album, released the same year, set out a blueprint for the band's sound, with a key ingredient being the heavy tone of Tony Iommi's guitar. His distinctive playing style developed after an accident at a sheet metal factory in which he severed the tips of the middle fingers of his fretting hand. To assist him, he created a pair of false fingertips using plastic from a detergent bottle and, crucially, down-tuned the strings on his guitar to make it easier for him to bend them. This compromise was a key to a much heavier sound. Iommi said, "I'd play a load of chords, and I'd have to play fifths. I couldn't play fourths because of my fingers. That helped me develop a style of playing, bending strings and hitting the open string at the same time just to make them sound wilder." With bassist Geezer Butler often following Iommi's lines, made the sound even heavier, and in the minds of most, gave birth to the genre of heavy metal as its own distinct sound, separating them from just another heavy rock band. The first album was essentially a run-through of their live set. Recorded in just a couple of days, it was a relative success. Buoyed by the acceptance of their new style, they sought to capitalise by releasing their follow-up record as quickly as possible. The process began with pre-production at Rockfield Studios in South Wales. Producer Roger Bain said that the band were cranked up as if they were on stage. The building we were in was a fairly old barn. The whole of the roof was actually moving. I can remember Ozzy saying, "Why don't we record here?" because the atmosphere of the place and the people was so great. The biggest chunk of time was spent in the rehearsing and routining stage, explains Bain. The object being that when you go in to record, you're not just experimenting in the studio. What you're doing when you go into the studio is transferring what you have into a recorded version. The main backing tracks were recorded at Regent Studios onto 4 tracks. Engineer Tom Allen remembers, "It was a good sounding studio. We always got good results in that room. It was an absolute hole, but it worked. The console was some custom-built thing, just a piece of old dross. It didn't even have any mid-range. We had 2 1-inch 4-track Studers and some Pultecs. We had a couple of Neumann U67s, and I managed to acquire an old Neumann M49. We had a couple of old AKG C12As and some Neumann U64s. I recorded Bill Ward's drums in stereo using these U64 pencil mics. Very few people recorded drums stereo back then. I thought it might be a good idea." Tom didn't mention a kick drum mic, but you can see from the photo that they had one. It's out of shot, but it's likely around that time they were using an AKG D12 or something similar. Tom Allen said, "The dearth of outboard gear wasn't a major problem at the time. Mic placement was probably one of the key ingredients. Having a successful album under our belts gave us the luxury of spending a bit more time doing this." One of the interesting effects that would have sounded quite novel at the time was the sound of Ozzy's voice on the intro of Iron Man.
I am Iron Man.
It was thought to be a ring modulator, as used for the Daleks on Doctor Who, and the same effect used on Iommi's solo on Paranoid. But according to Butler, it was actually Ozzy singing through an oscillating metal fan, the classic trick every kid has tried at some point. Ozzy also sings through a Leslie speaker on Planet Caravan, he said. Roger Bain used an oscillator on it, whatever that is. It looks like a fridge with a knob on it. Despite his persona, Ozzy wasn't the most confident when it came to his vocal abilities, as he often felt overshadowed by the band's instrumental prowess and struggled to find his voice. However, his raw, emotive delivery became a defining part of the album. It was shortly before the recording of Paranoid that Iommi acquired his now famous Monkey Gibson SG, modified by adding Simplux P90 pickups. Iommi says that for their second album, he wanted to try something different, as he'd previously been playing Fender Stratocasters and wanted to try Gibsons, and dabbled with Les Pauls but never felt completely comfortable with them. Instead favouring the SG, saying, "They're the most versatile guitars in the world. It's good for unleashing a storm and accompanying a picnic." His SG was plugged into a Laney LA100SM through 12-inch cabs, likely containing Goodman's Audium 1205 speakers, as they were the stock speakers at the time. He said, "Everybody used Hi-Watts and Marshalls, but I really liked the Laney with the 12-inch cabs. Basically, I set the presence, middle and treble on 10 with no bass whatsoever. The guitar volume was usually set on full, and the 3-way toggle switch was set on the up position for chords and in the treble spot for soloing. Most tube amps in the late 60s, early 70s sounded muddy when overdriven. To clean up the bottom end, rolling off the bass and adding a Dallas Rangemaster treble boost was necessary. This defined the early heavy metal sound. Geezer Butler played his 69 Fender Precision bass with flat wound strings into a Laney amp, slightly distorting it to give it a bit of an edge. A DI was also taken, much to his initial disdain, Tom Allen said. At first, Geese was horrified at plugging directly into the desk, but when he listened to the playback, he confessed that it was the first time he'd actually heard himself playing any notes. Bill Ward played his Ludwig kit, recorded using the mic technique mentioned earlier. This spacious but relatively dry approach gave the drums an upfront but wide sound, perfect for conveying a lively and direct feel. However, he wasn't entirely happy with the sound for everything, saying, "I had some disappointments, especially with the bass drum sound on Iron Man, which everybody raved about. They thought it was a great sound, but I'll be honest with you, I didn't like it. Back then, the best we could do was just hit the bass drum and hope for the best." We started Paranoid at Regent Sound, Ozzy remembers, and then we moved to this magnificent 16-track Island Studios on Basing Street. That's where we wrote the song Paranoid. Overdubs and mixing were completed at Island also. Once at Island, the 4-track basics were bounced to 16, giving the group more space to experiment with different sounds. For Iommi's guitar leads, for example, it was double tracking if not triple tracking, Bain says. It would be a close mic and an ambient mic that would be way off, but it was the combination that gave it that punch and size. We kept it straightforward. If you put compression and EQ over the top, you lose power. It just weakens the whole sound. The original way we worked was to keep it really raw. One of the most amazing aspects of Paranoid is that all the recording was completed in just a few days, as they weren't given much time to record the entire album, a fact that seems almost unbelievable, given the complexity of the music and how long it's endured the test of time. This tight deadline was partly due to the band's touring schedule and the label's desire to strike while the iron was hot. The attention given to pre-production definitely paid off. The title track is a perfect example of the spontaneity that characterized the recording process. According to Iommi, the song was written in just a few minutes. Needing a filler track to complete the album, he quickly came up with the iconic riff. The lyrics were equally rushed also. Geezer Butler wrote them in the studio, drawing on themes of mental health and alienation. Despite being created in such haste, Paranoid became one of Black Sabbath's most iconic songs, and a constant staple of their live performance. The title was originally intended to be War Pigs, which the cover definitely has more in common with. This was until the American end of the label thought that might not go down well considering the Vietnam War was in full swing at the time. Taking the title from Paranoid appeased the record execs and probably gave it a better title in the process, regardless of the cover image. The album was released in September 1970 in the UK, and with the prior release of the already popular Paranoid as a single, it quickly climbed the charts. It was still flying high when the album was released in the States in February 1971, where it was also a success, amazingly with virtually no airplay. Bill Ward said, "I knew those songs were different, and I felt remarkably assured within myself that we were making music that upon first listening might not be popular. However, those thoughts were outweighed by the overwhelming feeling I was part of a great band making great music." There's no doubt that Paranoid is a landmark album that redefined the boundaries of rock music and laid the groundwork for heavy metal. According to Rolling Stone's Joe Levy, Sabbath ruled for bummed-out kids in the 70s, and nearly every heavy metal and extreme rock band of the last 3 decades, bands such as Metallica, Nirvana and Slipknot, owes a debt of worship to Black Sabbath.